Tonight we have Liz Garst, and she's going to be talking about Khrushchev and corn. Corn and Khrushchev. But Liz, I got to take my glasses up, she manages banking and farming interests for the Garst family farm in Coon Rapids, right, Iowa. She has a BA in English Literature and an MS in Agricultural Economics and also an MBA. She is the board member of White Rock Conservancy, and that is kind of dealing with agriculture and conservation and meshing that together. You can talk more about that, I'm sure. But I think there's a little map that talks about White Rock Conservancy over here and might talk more about that, so you can grab one of those. The Roswell and Elizabeth Garst farmstead, which is her grandparents', is on the National Register of Historic Places. So if you haven't seen it, go see it. All right, right now we're going to have Liz talk to you about her program.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, and I invite anyone who has burning questions to raise your hand anytime. So again, I'm Liz Garst. I'm the granddaughter of Roswell and Elizabeth Garst, and I like to introduce myself by explaining my father's sweatshirt. My father was a very big man, and he had a sweatshirt that said, Bob's Boy. Bob was the nickname of Roswell Garst. Mary's husband. Mary was my mother, who was managed our cattle operation, but was also very involved in big-time corporate agribusiness board of directors and was on the Chicago Federal Reserve. Dave's brother, Dave Garst, was the head of sales for Garst Seed Company and was TV and well-known. John's cousin, that's John Crystal, who was head of the banking division of Iowa and on the Board of Regents and ran for governor and other prominent things. And at the very bottom of the sweatshirt it said, "And some kid's dad." And I also like to tell, by way of introduction, that I like to confess something bad about me. My parents were second cousins, which means that I am an inbred Garst. And that's really bad, because everything else about this story is how good hybrids are and crossing. But I am an inbred, just needed to tell you that.
And line breeding is important.
Line breeding is important, you're right. So I'm going to tell you a little about the story of my grandparents, which was really the story of the explosion of productivity in Midwest agriculture all through mid-century. We were just fabulously successful in increasing productivity in agriculture, and my grandfather had a lot to do with that. Of course, he didn't have everything to do with it, but his story is the story of what happened in agriculture. To backtrack a little, my two great-grandfathers moved to Coon Rapids in Iowa in 1869 to start the first general store in the town of Coon Rapids. My two great-grandfathers could have appeared on Stephen's sweatshirt too, if it wasn't too long ago. One of my great-grandfathers was governor of Iowa around the turn of the century. My other great-grandfather, in addition to running the store in Coon Rapids, was a land speculator. He happened to own land in Roswell, New Mexico, an apple orchard, and learned that a railroad was coming through his property. He learned that on the day that Roswell Garst was born, which is how he got the name. We've been a commercial family for a really long time. In addition to running the store, he bought and sold a lot of farmland in his day. He was sort of a land speculator, but a storekeeper. This is Roswell's father. Roswell was really interested in agriculture even as a very young man and moved on to a farm owned by his uncle in the early 1920s, and even as a teenager was experimenting with forages for dairy cows, chicken breeding, etc. In the early 20s, he courted my grandmother Elizabeth. She was a college graduate and a school teacher, and knew for one thing for sure, she did not want to marry a farmer under any circumstances. But he was a great salesman, as I'll further describe, put a full court press on her 100-day letter writing campaign, and she succumbed to his pressures and married him. and ended up on this little farm married to a chicken breeder, which just hadn't been her idea of how it should work out. She talked Roswell in the mid-20s to moving into Des Moines to start a residential real estate project, and like a 50th and University in Des Moines. Fortunately, they did not mortgage the farm because in 1929 they went broke. And Roswell said, with this housing development, Roswell said, if we're going to be broke, let's be peasants, not paupers. It's way better to be poor in the country than it is to be poor in the city. And he insisted they move back to the farm. While they were in Des Moines, they met Henry A. Wallace. Who here has heard of Henry Wallace?
Yes.
Okay. Everybody's heard from Iowa about Henry Wallace, and one reason we've all heard of Henry Wallace is there were actually 3 Henry Wallaces, all of them very famous in their day. The first Henry Wallace started Wallace's Farmer, the premier farm magazine of the era, and he ran something called the Country Life Commission for Teddy Roosevelt. The next Henry Wallace, the next generation, was Secretary of Agriculture of the United States and also ran Wallace's Farmer. The third Henry Wallace, Henry A. Wallace, was about 10 years older than my grandpa. And they met each other socially in Des Moines. Henry A. Wallace was named in 2000 as the most influential citizen in Iowa of the last century, the most important Iowan of the last century. And he was famous for lots of different reasons. As editor of Wallace's Farmer, proposed the New Deal programs to bring the farm economy out of the farm depression. And when Franklin Roosevelt got the presidency, he made Henry A. his Secretary of Agriculture to implement the proposals to bring the farm economy out of the depression. Henry A. was a wonderful bureaucrat. He was really good at it. He became Roosevelt's vice president, and then he became his Secretary of Commerce. He had a lot to do with organizing our country for World War II. He was just a really brilliant administrator and had a lot to do with sort of supplying the war effort. He ran for president on the Progressive ticket in 1948, and I'll tell you more about that later. His real claim to fame in Iowa, though, was to start a brand new industry, the hybrid seed corn industry. The science of hybrids had been understood for 10, 15 years, but Wallace was the first man to understand that hybrids were a business. To make hybrids, you have to make a cross just before you sell the seed. Wallace understood that corn was a business. It was a new thought. And he started Pioneer Hybrid Seed Corn Company in 1925, more or less, in his backyard, more or less. Roswell was very attentive to things innovative in agriculture, and he knew Wallace socially, so right off the bat he got some of Wallace's hybrid seed, this new idea, and tried it on his farm. And when they moved back to the farm in 1929, Roswell went to Henry Wallace and said, I love your product. I want to sell your product. I want to raise hybrid seed and sell it for you because your product's great. They never had a contract because Henry Wallace could never agree to negotiate what would happen after they sold 50,000 bushels. And in his heyday, Roswell was selling 2 million bushels, but it was a brand new product. No one understood this product at all when they first got going. Wallace's company ran the science of hybrids. They did the inbred breeding and the crossing and all that. Roswell's contribution in this brand new industry, he said, I want to sell your product, and he figured out how to sell it, which was not easy to do in 1929. Corn was so cheap in 1929, we were burning it. But a much bigger problem in selling hybrid seed corn was in 1929, we didn't have any cash inputs. Farmers saved their own seed, no cash. Farmers used fertilizer called manure, no cash. The only power was draft horses raised on the farm, no cash. The only cash in agriculture in 1929 was salt for livestock production and nails to put up fences for livestock. Maybe you might put a little cash into grinding your corn, But other than that, there was just really almost no cash in agriculture. Roswell would show up and say, I have this wonderful new product, hybrid seed corn, it's only $8 a bag. And farmers would go, $8 a bag? Are you kidding? No way. Nobody had $8 cash in 1929. He'd ask for the $8, he'd always get turned down. He'd then say, all right, don't give me $8, instead, take this bag of seed, plant it side by side next to your open pollinated or old-fashioned corn, and I'll come back in the fall and take 1/2 the increase in yield as my payment. This product was so good that 1/2 the increase in yield was worth way more than $8 even in 1929. This product doubled yields just instantly, just exploded productivity just instantly. In the fall, he'd show up and say, well, that was a tough deal and my trunk's full anyway. I'll tell you what, I'll let you out of that deal if you'll now give me the $8 and your order for next year. Another early innovation was who sold it. At first it was thought that drummers would go around on trains and cheap suits and stay in cheap hotels. That's how most things got sold into our rural economy, sort of traveling salesmen. Roswell developed the method of going to the banker in each town, asking the banker who is the most progressive farmer in this community, calling on that farmer, getting them to try the product, and then the next year recruiting them to sell to their neighbors. The farmer-dealer system of selling hybrid seed corn, which is how it still mostly gets sold, because farmers want to see it in action in their own neighborhood. They want to be able to kick the tires on this product. So that was a very innovative system to use farmer dealers to get it sold. A third innovation was what to do about landlord-tenant leases. By 1935, 50%, more than 50% of Iowa was owned by insurance companies. They had been the mortgage lenders to agriculture, foreclosed on half the state by 1935. But we still needed the labor for farming, so the insurance companies said to the farmers they were foreclosing on, just stay on the farm, and we'll convert this to a shared crop lease. Landlords will provide the land, the tenants will provide the labor, and they'll split the crop 50. So about 50% of Iowa, a little more than that, was getting farmed that way when this cash input showed up. And the tenants had been spending the cash in agriculture because livestock was a tenant function. So the tenants were buying the salt and nails for their livestock. And at first it was assumed, well, they'd buy the cash input too, the hybrid seed corn. But they had to share the crop with their landlord, 50-50, so they only got half the benefit of this investment. So Roswell spent a lot of time in Des Moines pounding on the doors of insurance companies, trying to convince them they should require their tenants to use hybrids, and they should pay for half the cost of it since they got the benefit of it. In a famous family story, Roswell was delivered to the sidewalk by his collar and his belt at one point. But Equitable of Iowa, which is the Hubble family, got the logic. They understood the logic. And insurance companies were cash poor in the 30s too. They didn't have any cash, but they started doing this, paying for half the cash input, which sort of saved the company in the very early days, requiring their tenants to use hybrids. So that really helped the business take off, and it did. When Roswell started his business in 1929, 0.5% of corn in the Midwest was in hybrids. And in 1940, which is 11 years later, 100% of corn in the Midwest was in hybrids, which means we went from subsistence agriculture to cash agriculture in 11 years, which is phenomenally fast. At least it was phenomenally fast before we had all these new computer technologies. You know, now we have new computer things in 18 months, but 11 years to just really transform agriculture was really fast. Good salesmanship had something to do with it, but the real reason it went so fast is we had universal education. All our farmers knew how to read, and in particular, they knew how to read Wallace's Farmer and learn about hybrid seed corn. So it went super fast, unbelievably fast. Really transformed agriculture just almost overnight. But hybrids were only the first step. The next big revolution in agriculture in the Midwest was mechanization. we were still hand-picking corn in 1929. And I bet people in this room had dads who bragged about how many bushels of corn they could pick in a day in 1929. And the problem, while we were still hand-picking corn in 29, we had cars in 1929, we just didn't have corn pickers in 1929. And the reason why was open pollinated or old-fashioned corn could be on 10-foot stalks or 2-foot stalks. It could have 4 ears or no ears. As Roswell always said about hybrid seed corn, or open pollinated corn, you don't know who the daddy is. You don't know who the daddy is. An innate feature of hybrid seed corn is that it's uniform, because the inbred lines that are crossed together are uniform. So every plant's exactly the same height if it's well produced. 1 or 2 ears is on the stalk at exactly the same spot on every plant. It had naturally vigorous roots and stalks thanks to hybrid vigor or heterosis. The first thing they bred into hybrid seed corn other than crossing it and getting the heterosis was the stiff stalk gene out of Iowa State University. Once they had that stiff stalk gene and hybrid vigor, the corn would stand at harvest. And the corn was always in the same spot, so they could invent a corn picker. Once they invented the corn picker, then they had a tractor and could plant and cultivate. But harvest was the labor bottleneck in corn production. No point mechanizing until they figured out harvest, and hybrids made that happen. Roswell was involved in the local machinery dealership. He sold machinery to the Soviet Union later, but mostly he talked up machinery just as a way to utilize or a benefit of the hybrid seed corn. The next big benefit or big boost about corn was what to do about fertilizer. The manure was pretty good, but insufficient for the yield potential that hybrids had. And our soils were starting to deplete a little bit. We think that Roswell used 50% of all the commercial fertilizer used in the state of Iowa the first year there was such a thing. Meaning he brought in 1 carload of potash in the mid-30s. But a little later he got really plugged into nitrogen fertilizer. Nitrogen is super important in boosting yields in all grasses, corn's a grass, and he started getting really interested in nitrogen fertilizer. To give you a flavor of his salesmanship, he'd pitch farmers not just hybrid corn, but everything on the farm related. He would tell farmers they need to put fertilizer on their hay and pasture ground, their grasses too, and would benefit from some nitrogen. If the farmers were reluctant, he didn't really argue a lot. He'd just pull a sample bag of nitrogen out of the trunk of his car, paint the letter N in nitrogen, hopefully on a hill near a highway on the farmer's land, and leave. So wherever he had been, there were dark green N's stalking him across the Midwest, demonstrating what nitrogen fertilizer can do for you. He set up his kids in a local fertilizer dealership. He sold fertilizer and fertilizer technology to the Soviet Union later, but mostly he was talking up nitrogen as a way to further benefit hybrid seed. He had some kind of special connections to nitrogen. Sort of another whole sidebar on Roswell's life is he quite regularly got on the train, went to Washington, D.C., and yelled at members of our government on a variety of topics. A lot of agriculture stuff. He was very involved in corn hog ratios and land bank programs, and he just did it as a private citizen. During World War II, Roswell and a lot of farmers were starting to figure out how important nitrogen was in corn production. Really important. But during World War II, we were way short on nitrogen for farmers because nitrogen is the main ingredient in making bombs. We were reminded of this in the Oklahoma City bombing, where just a truckload of farm agriculture can, blow up Oklahoma City. During World War II, all our bombs were made out of nitrogen. So farmers couldn't get it. But there was more and more interest. We need that nitrogen in agriculture. And at the end of World War II, there was a very organized effort to convert the nitrogen bomb factories into ag nitrogen factories. And Roswell's brother, Jonathan Garst, was the guy in charge of that conversion. Roswell's brother also administered a tax credit program as we were heading into the Korean conflict a little later. We were way short of food as we were heading into the Korean conflict. We needed more food fast. And our government got it by developing a tax credit program for fertilizer manufacturers to give a boost to cheaper fertilizer, which just instantly boosted yields. It was a program that worked to get us more food fast. Roswell's brother Jonathan Garst was the czar in charge of that tax credit program as well. So he was really into fertilizer. The third really big innovation of Roswell was how we feed beef in the Midwest. In the old days, it's thought what the Midwest had was yellow corn, the grain itself. And yellow corn is too expensive to feed to a cow for the whole year. It takes a cow to be pregnant and wean a calf. That's a 1-year cycle. And you would go broke feeding yellow grain to a cow for the whole year it took her to produce a calf. Furthermore, yellow grain's a horrible food for pregnant cows. Just like people, cows are not supposed to be fat when they're pregnant. And corn's a fattening food. It's carbohydrate. That's all it is. It's just eating carbs and nothing else. It gets you fat, but that's all. And you can't do that to pregnant cows. They're not just supposed to be fat. So the way we used to produce beef in this country was all the cows were kept out west on cheap grass. Oklahoma, Colorado, Wyoming. They'd ship the calves into the Midwest to be put in our feed lots to be fed the yellow grain, to be fat. To backtrack a little bit, the byproduct of the seed company was corn cobs. Most corn, commercial corn, is combine, which means a combination of picking and shelling the corn. But seed corn needs to be brought into the plant on the cob. It really helps to protect the germination of the seed itself if it's on the cob while it's dried. So, seed companies had big corn cob piles because they dry the corn and then shell it after it's dried. The town plant in Coon Rapids, which no longer is there but was until recently, was the world's largest plant. Not the world's largest company, but the world's largest plant, which meant that Coon Rapids had for decades the world's largest corn cob pile. Wonderful tourist asset that nobody in Coon Rapids ever fully developed. But every kid in Coon Rapids knew how great this corn cob pile was. We'd sneak around the back where no grown-ups could see us and slide down cardboard. What a great mountain to ski on. And grown-ups would threaten us with air pockets and stuff, but I never died doing it. It was fun. So Roswell had this big cob pile. At first there was no problem about the cob pile because he sold it every fall to local people to heat their houses. Corn cobs were the fuel of the Midwest. That's how we heated our houses. But in the 1940s, a crisis started developing in Coon Rapids with the world's largest corn cob pile because people stopped buying cobs because everyone was converting their cob furnaces into fuel oil furnaces. So much cheaper, so much cleaner, so much easier to handle. And the demand for corn cobs disappeared. What can you do with a big pile of corn cobs? Well, let's see. You can put them on muddy roads, but nothing really helps muddy roads. Livestock bedding, but it's really rough and very dusty. Anyone want to tell us about how they work in outhouses? Oh, dear. Sears and Roebuck catalogs, they're better than corn cobs in an outhouse. No one knew what to do with them. So it was a really big problem for Roswell what to do with all these corn cobs. He always read land-grant university research from all over the Midwest, and he read some research out of Ohio State University that ruminants can digest up to 1/3 of their ration in cellulose. Translated to plain English, cows can eat corn cobs. And he wrote the professor and said, I've got a lot of corn cobs. Only 1/3 of the ration? Don't you think I could bump that up? And the Ohio professor wrote back and said, I don't know. Roswell wrote him another letter. He was a great letter writer and said, well, what do you think will happen if I push the ration up? And the professor wrote back, Ohio State does not pay me enough to think. And besides, I don't have a lot of corn cobs. You do. Figure it out. So Roswell, rather classically or typically, he took whatever the land-grant colleges said and multiplied by 3. So he just started out feeding a pen of cattle almost 100% corn cobs, supplemented with molasses for a little quick energy, urea, which is nitrogen, which ruminant ruminant bugs can convert into protein, and a little mineral mix. And he figured out that animals on that diet could survive. They wouldn't get fat, but they would survive. And from there he went to the idea that every Midwest farmer had lots of cheap feed. All Midwest farmers had corn stalks, corn leaves, corn cobs. And he advocated we should be harvesting the cellulose, or the byproducts of corn, and have our own cows right here in the Midwest rather than out west. Feed our byproducts to our cows and then get our calves fattened with the yellow corn. And so the home farm in Coon Rapids was the first beef cow-calf producing farm in Iowa. And that idea took off. I mean, we figured out how to use more of our byproducts to maintain cows here in the Midwest. He had other ideas too. He observed in his seed fields that corn from the prior fall might germinate and pollute his genetics in his seed fields. Corn was going to overwinter and sprout. Why not just try planting corn in the fall? Be easier. It's drier in the fall. More time in the fall. It didn't work, but he tried it. He tried everything. But when he had an idea that worked, he really wrote it and sold it and made it part of what his missionary zeal to get agriculture to be more productive. A couple of sidebars on him. He made a career out of harassing Iowa State University. His parents had both graduated from college. They sent him to college 5 different times, and he never made it. Not because he flunked out, he just wanted to go home and continue his experiments in agriculture. He just wasn't interested. But clearly one of his motivations through his life was to be better and smarter than Iowa State University at all times. One of my memories of him is he came to see me in college and he was depressed. I'd never seen him depressed ever, not even down, and he was clearly something was wrong. I was like, what's wrong, Granddad? You seem really sad and depressed. And he said, I am. I'm losing it. I'm not mad at Iowa State University about anything right now. There's something really wrong with me. He came out of that slump. He would call up the Dean of Agriculture every 6 weeks, 2 months, and say, I'm coming up to yell at you, and I want you to assemble livestock specialists, whatever his topic of the day was. You bring these professors in there. He always demanded lunch while he was haranguing the poor dean. And they appreciated him. He was on their case, but they learned a lot from him, and he trained a lot of their students. A lot of students came out on field days. The other big sidebar on his day was he was colorful, flamboyant, and the farm press loved him. He could tell a great story, he had a great tour, and he became really very famous all over the Midwest. He put out private extension bulletins because he didn't think Iowa State did a good job, and mailed a couple 100,000 extension bulletins twice a year for many, many years to all his customers, telling them how to produce corn better, how to feed cattle better, and all of that. It's intermission. Anybody got any questions or memories? Or anything about what I just talked about?
I talked to, and I can't tell you the family's name, but their grandfather was one of the ones that Roswell came up to and gave the sequence to. And exactly what you said, of course, was that he would take half the increase, the story I was told that he would take anything over 50 bushel the acre. And obviously that's how it got started.
Every town had a story like that. Because again, and our family is bankers. I don't know if everybody here knows Bob, but I'm a banker, and we got this interest because bankers know farmers. That's really important. So yeah, this is just sort of a pictures of illustrating a little bit of this. So That's my grandmother Elizabeth and Roswell in front of their house in Coon Rapids, which you can visit. It's open to the public. The living and dining room have a beautiful photography exhibit of the Khrushchev visit. And you're welcome to just stop by and visit that if you're on Highway 141 Coon Rapids. This is Roswell's father and uncles, early days. Next. The first Garst store in Coon Rapids started in 1869. Next. Roswell's father, Edward Garst. Next. His siblings, including in the back, Jonathan, the guy who wrote, who administered the tax credit programs and was an ag researcher at UC Davis for many, many years. My grandmother Elizabeth, graduating from college, where she moved as a bride. Reports where she cried for 2 days straight that she had found herself there. But by 1959, there was the same house. Things had gotten quite a bit better. She chose well. Next. The portrait of my grandmother, this one by my great aunt Louise McBroom, who studied with Grant Woods. And this one, best of show at the Iowa State Fair in like 1929. My grandmother hated this picture because she was pregnant when it was painted, and she thought that it showed that she was pregnant. And ladies should never be shown as pregnant in public, ever. So she didn't like this painting, but I sure do. Next. Roswell in his heyday. Next. Henry Wallace. Next. His partners at Garst and Thomas. I forgot to explain that little part. The business was real risky at the beginning. A few years into it, it was clear it was going to take off. They needed capital to build a real facility. They had been processing the corn in the barn, and they needed a real plant. And Roswell was out selling the corn all the time, so he needed more management. They brought in the Thomases. Charlie had been hurt in a farm accident and had a bad arm, really couldn't farm anymore. So he was brought on to oversee the production of the hybrid seed corn, and he was married to the town's richest heiress with a lot of money. So his wife Bertha built the plant. Next. And that was the first part of the plant that was just recently torn down. Next. That's Tom Crystal, another banker, brother of John. Next. Roswell showing corn silage.
When did they actually start silage, chopping silage? Do you know?
I would guess he did that starting in the early 50s. So, real early 50s would be when that started. On a farm magazine cover. Next. Telling people what to do. He always was good at that. Next. All right, we're done for the moment. Any other questions? We really lived, especially older people in the room have lived through a real amazing, we were at 30 bushels when this story started, and now we're at 210, I think. And it hasn't stopped even now. But we are famous all over the world for how quickly our agriculture developed and how good we are at it. All right, I'm going to go into the second part of the story if there's no other. Stalin was the head of the Soviet Union in 1953, and he died in 1953. And there was a little confusion about who would be in charge. They put 3 people in charge. And in case you haven't had this experience yet, never try to have 3 people in charge of anything. It's a really bad deal. It's very confusing, but Khrushchev got the reins. He clearly became the dictator in 1955. He was the man by 1955. And he inherited a catastrophe. His country was really hungry when he came to power. They had no meat, milk, and eggs, and porridge consumption even wasn't that good. They'd had some mass famine in the Soviet Union as recently as 1954. The really big problem was that Stalin had believed the way you have a strong country is you have a strong military and you have a strong industrial base. Stalin did not ignore agriculture. He raped it. He took all the investment capital out of agriculture to put in the military and into the factories. He forced labored hundreds of thousands of rural people out of the countryside into the military and the factories. Some historians estimate that as many as 20 million people died premature deaths under Stalin's regime. That's way more than Hitler. That's bad. And most of those deaths of 20 million people were country people because he was forcing collectivization on the country and people didn't want to collectivize, and anybody who didn't want to collectivize he killed. He killed lots of people. So by the time Khrushchev came to power, the effects of all this were really showing up. No investment, no people, no attention. Khrushchev had been trained as a mining engineer, a real low, pretty bad education, kind of a 2-year community college degree in mining. But he came from the Ukraine, which is the best ag area of the Soviet Union. He'd been a shepherd, knew a little about ag as a kid. And he became in charge of the city of Moscow for Stalin when he worked for Stalin. And he was in charge of figuring out how to feed Moscow, and that was real hard to do with no food in the country. So he really got plugged in to how important food is in an economy. It's thought when he came to power, he probably cared more about food production than he cared about the arms race, which is saying a lot. He believed that you have to have a strong food economy before you can have a strong country. I do like my audiences to agree with the communist on at least one thing. So don't you agree that it's a good idea that you have to have a strong food economy before you can have a strong country?
Well-fed people are always happy.
Let's have a little more enthusiasm.
Yeah.
You need a strong food economy to have a strong country, right?
Right.
Thank you. Thank you. Important concept for us to keep remembering. Most people in this country didn't know how hungry they were. Our government made quite a career out of painting the Soviet Union as very strong, quite a bit stronger than they were, so that our military people could get bigger military budgets. But to the extent we understood how hungry they were, generally speaking, we were really glad. Because, of course, in 1955, we hated their guts. And most people thought if they would get real hungry, maybe even starve, before World War III would start, well, that would make our job fighting World War III a little bit easier. Most people in both countries thought we were going to have World War III. Wasn't a question of if, just when were we going to have World War III. 60% of the people in this country thought we were going to have World War III. 60% of the people in that country thought we were going to have World War III, and everybody on both sides knew when we had World War III it was going to be nuclear and we were all going to die. It was a scary, scary time. It really was. Shortly after he came to power, Khrushchev made an offhanded comment into the world press. He said the U.S. has good agriculture and the Soviet Union needs an Iowa corn belt. Khrushchev named Iowa by name in 1955. We want an Iowa corn belt. And what he was talking about was not just our unbelievable productivity in corn, but the fact that we were putting it into livestock. We were the leaders in meat, milk, and eggs. And that's what he really wanted, meat, milk, and eggs. And we were just the superstars in that department, not just corn, but feeding it. So that comment, the Soviet Union needs an Iowa corn belt, got reported all around the world because it was the first nice thing that any Soviet had said about the U.S. since World War II ended. And here this new premier is complimenting us. This was unheard of. So that comment got a lot of press. In response to that, the editor of the Des Moines Register wrote an op-ed piece in the Des Moines Register. His name was Lawrence Soth, and his op-ed won the Pulitzer Prize. It was written as an open letter to Khrushchev, though no letter was mailed to Khrushchev. It was just an op-ed piece for Iowa. It's just stylistically an open letter to Khrushchev. And what the op-ed piece says was, "Dear Mr. Khrushchev, you are right. U.S. has good ag and Iowa has the best in the world. You should send a delegation to Iowa to learn how to grow food so our two countries can compete economically instead of by this stupid arms race." This editorial brings us back to Henry A. Wallace, who ran for president in 1948. Henry A. Wallace was the leader of the Progressive Party, and the Progressive Party had two main planks. The first one was racial equality in America. Henry Wallace had studied with George Washington Carver, who became later a famous peanut breeder, but that black seed breeder started out in Iowa State University, lived with the Wallace family very close, and he got real interested in racial equality even as a college student. The other main plank of the Progressive Party was what we should do about the Soviet Union. The Progressive Party, and Henry A. Wallace in particular, thought the way we are going to get out of this World War III that everyone knew was coming was, instead of building nuclear bombs, we should be reaching out to them. We should be trading with them. We should have educational exchanges with them, cultural exchanges with them. He even advocated that we should share technology with our enemy, that we should bring them into our world and bring them to our bosom, and just through economic trade and cultural and educational trade, lower the heat. It's why he ran for president. He really thought this was the way to go, but America did not agree with him. He got 2% of the vote nationally. He got 11% of the vote in Iowa. He was roundly denounced as a commie for these viewpoints. A lot of people thought he was a commie, somehow overlooking the fact he owned Pioneer Hybrid Seed Corn Company, the single most successful agribusiness capitalist enterprise in the Midwest. He was the best capitalist we had, but people thought he was a commie for these views. And I must tell you that even in Iowa, he had other flaws. I mean, it wasn't just this. He was a little bit into mysticism. Some of my family voted for him, but some of them didn't. You know, he was a little bit just off in a few odd ways, despite his brilliance. So, let's see. The op-ed piece, that's where it was. So here's this op-ed piece reflecting the idea that we should, what it really said was we should share technology with them. Come learn our technology so we can have a trade relationship instead of this World War III that's coming. So the op-ed writer, Lawrence Soth, he was just reflecting Henry Wallace's viewpoint. And that idea ran really deep in the state during that era, that we should be reaching out to them. Henry Wallace was really influential in our state. Although no letter was really mailed to Khrushchev, the Soviet spies read the Des Moines Register quite regularly because they were interested in our agriculture, and the Des Moines Register was the leading ag newspaper in the United States, so they kept their eye on our paper because they wanted to know what we were up to. So the Soviet spies read the editorial, immediately translated it, gave it to Khrushchev. Khrushchev picked up the telephone, called the U.S. State Department, and accepted the invitation to send a delegation to Iowa. The State Department had no idea what he was talking about because the State Department did not read the Des Moines Register. And when they got it figured out, they didn't like it. The State Department thought this was a proposal to share technology with our enemy, and they didn't think we should do that. But the governor, part of our congressional delegation, people at the college, there were a lot of progressives in Iowa, and a little drumbeat happened to let this happen. It was finally agreed a plane could come over from Moscow to visit Iowa, but the plane never stopped in Washington, D.C. It just flew into Des Moines. Nobody, our federal government, would have anything to do with it. They didn't want to endorse being nice to commies, so they just boycotted the whole subject. We're sure they sent some spies out to check out what was going on, but no official endorsement of any kind. Iowa State was put in charge of the visit of the delegation, And Iowa State asked the Farm Bureau to pick out farms to show the delegation. And this delegation, by the way, does not include Khrushchev. This is just an ag delegation. The Farm Bureau wanted to make the point to the Soviets that family farms are the only way to go, family farms. And to make this point really loud, they decided to show the delegation only farms with no hired labor. Given the machinery set of 1955, a farm with no hired labor could be 80 acres. If you were from a big German Catholic family with a lot of boys, you could get up to about 300 acres with no hired labor. The biggest farm we showed this delegation was 300 acres, and at the same time, the smallest farm in the Soviet Union was 20,000 acres. So just wildly different sizes. The delegation went through Jefferson, Iowa, where my mother's father was the bank president. And it's kind of a complicated story, but my mother's father was put in charge of a reception for the delegation. And he invited his first cousin Roswell over to meet these guys. Roswell got to the head of the delegation, who was a guy named Mickiewicz. He was then the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture of the Soviet Union. A little later, he became the Secretary of Agriculture of the Soviet Union. Roswell got to him and said, "I'm so glad you're here. You need to learn how to grow food so we compete economically instead of by the stupid arms race." Roswell was already a progressive under the influences of friend and mentor Henry Wallace. But Roswell said to the head of the delegation, "I got to tell you, Mickiewicz, Iowa State University is showing you really out-of-date technology. The Farm Bureau is showing you ridiculously too small a farm. You need to come see my farm. I got state-of-the-art technology. My farm isn't as good or as big as yours, but at least it's on a scale where you can figure out what to do." Mickiewicz said, "I'd love to come." So Roswell went to Iowa State, and they very politely said, "No, Roswell, everything's arranged, and besides, the Farm Bureau is in charge." He went to the Farm Bureau and said, "I want to bring the delegation to my farm." The Farm Bureau said, "Hell no, Roswell. Not only do you have hired labor, you are not a member of the Farm Bureau. No way, no way." This family tension with the Farm Bureau continues to the current era. So Roswell went back to Mickiewicz and said, "I'm really sorry, I cannot arrange a visit of your delegation to my farm, but this is a free country, and if you know how to insist, you can come see my farm." And Mickiewicz said, "I want to. Tell me what to do." Roswell said, "Just keep your mouth shut tonight. Tomorrow morning, load your delegation up in Iowa State's cars to go on their planned tour to Newton, and at this last second, just refuse to get in Iowa State's car. And I'll send a car up, and my guy will open the door, and you and your interpreter, you just get in my car. And they might be people yelling at you for getting in my car, but no one will shoot you for getting in my car. No one will even put you in jail for getting in my car. This is a free country. And if you just get in my car, it can happen." So that's how it happened. Roswell kidnapped him from underneath the nose of Iowa State University. It was the fall, it was a beautiful day, it was the perfect time. And Roswell was a fabulous salesman because he showed and demonstrated everything. He had strip plots showing different hybrids, strip plots showing different fertilizer levels, pens of cattle on different rations. He always demonstrated his ideas. The guy just spent one day on the farm, but shortly after the delegation returned to the Soviet Union, a letter came from Khrushchev directly to Roswell, inviting him to go to the Soviet Union and sell them hybrid seed corn. He got across the main point. Hybrids, genetics. Genetics are the first step. They still are. Genetics is everything in our productivity. And he got that across. Khrushchev needed the hybrid seed corn. There was quite a delay before he went over there because he went to Washington and asked the State Department to give him clearance for export licenses. And at first, the State Department didn't even say no. We had no policy on trade with the Soviet Union in 1955. We weren't trading at all. We weren't even getting their caviar on the vodka, nothing, in either way. So the Soviet Union had, or the State Department had to invent a policy upon this request, and the policy was no. This was sharing technology with the Soviet Union, and no. So Roswell, who was a very persistent guy, if you haven't figured it out by now, went to Washington like every other day, visiting on the State Department. He recruited the governor to help him press for export license and part of our congressional delegation. But finally, he hired a lobbyist to try to get that to work. None of that worked, but he was a pretty good friend of a famous diplomat and New York Times journalist named Averell Harriman. And he just rounded up Harriman and took him to the State Department. And Harriman said, either give Roswell the export licenses or the New York Times is going to start a big series on the subject of whose Iron Curtain is this anyway? Is it our Iron Curtain or is it their Iron Curtain? Finally, the State Department said, okay, here are the export licenses. We are giving them to you because we are sure that you will fail. They won't accept Western technology. They won't come up with any hard currency to pay you. And we're giving them to you because we are so sick of you. Please just go away. Once he had the export licenses, still in 1955, he accepted Khrushchev's visit and off he went. He was invited to tour the Soviet Union as his very first step. And he did, and in 1955, it was bad. 1955, in this country, we were 100% hybridized, 100% mechanized. We were not 100% fertilized, but we were getting there fast. We were just skyrocketing in our productivity. In 1955, in the Soviet Union, they had no hybrids, no machinery, no fertilizer, no good rural farm roads, no storage processing packaging, but the single worst problem was no geneticists. Stalin's Secretary of Agriculture was a guy named Lysenko, and Lysenko hit in 2000 the list of the 100 most evil people of the entire world in the last century. So this is a distinguished list of Stalin and Hitler and Lysenko. Lysenko was a self-styled geneticist in the Soviet Union. He had insane theories about genetics. To give you a flavor, communist view of genetics, he thought if you planted a seed in a dry area, it would sprout, understood that it was in a dry area, rearrange its cell structure to become drought tolerant in that same generation, and lock that as a heritable characteristic until the environment sent a different message. This is really crazy. But much worse than that was he was the Secretary of Agriculture for Stalin, and so he just killed everybody who disagreed with him. He killed off the genetics knowledge base of the Soviet Union. There were a few sent off to Siberia, but mostly they were killed. So Khrushchev didn't have any way to get to step one, the hybrids. On that trip, Khrushchev himself invited Roswell to his dacha right outside Moscow, and Khrushchev himself wanted to buy the hybrid seed corn. Pretty amazing that a Soviet premier is out buying ag inputs, but he was more like a CEO of a company rather than our president. He was really interested in agriculture. It's what he cared about most. And he had never met a real American. He had never met an American and wanted to meet an American. So Khrushchev negotiated the seed corn purchase. They hit it off. They were both quite a bit alike. They were both very interested in agriculture. Roswell could talk for a couple months straight about agriculture without even taking a breath. Khrushchev was the same way. He was intensely interested in agriculture. Both of them loved to tell stories. Both of them had big belly laughs. Both of them were country boys. To tell you the truth, both of them were pretty crude guys. The most famous thing Khrushchev ever did was pound his shoe on the podium at the UN. At least in our eyes, that's the most famous thing he did. How crude to put your shoe on the podium at the UN. That was in the 60s. Roswell never had a chance to pound his shoe on the podium at the UN, but he was famous all over his trade territory for putting his feet on farm wives' kitchen tables while selling seed corn to their husbands. And he was known to pee in front of ladies and utter hugely embarrassing things to my grandmother. He was just pretty crude, and so was Khrushchev. Khrushchev did buy the seed corn, and he immediately and grotesquely misapplied this technology. He had good motives. He wanted meat, milk, and eggs. And in his desperation to get that, he planted corn everywhere in the Soviet Union. Started right out planting long-season corn in Siberia. No adapting it, no testing it. A common joke of the era was someone said to Mrs. Khrushchev, "Mrs. Khrushchev, your husband's planting corn every place but on the moon." And Mrs. Khrushchev says, "Shh, don't give him the idea." And even today, if you run into a former Soviet person and fall into a conversation about Khrushchev, their first words are, "corn crazy." Research later indicated he badly overdid corn, but net, it helped him. It wasn't an unmitigated success because it was so badly overdone, but it was better to do this than not have corn at all. By some margin, it really helped them eat better. Khrushchev only lasted in power for 9 years because he was regularly too rash. This overdoing the corn was the most expensive example of this character flaw. But the most well-known example of being too rash, not listening to his advisors, not thinking it through, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. He didn't really want World War III. He just didn't think it through to the step after next. So they got rid of him because he was regularly kind of overdoing it. They progressed. They didn't kill him. They just banished him when they got rid of him, which was progress. But he only was in power for 9 years. Khrushchev invited Roswell back again in 1956 and asked him to tour Eastern Europe, trying to help them with their agriculture, which was really the Soviet Union's breadbasket. And in that trip, he made a big deal about inviting my grandmother to go on the visit. Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev in his first couple years were portrayed to the world as Iron Men dictators, so tough and mean that they didn't have families. They were portrayed as really strong men. Khrushchev really wanted to lower the heat. He really didn't want World War III. He wanted to soften the image of the Soviet Union. So he was the first Soviet who sort of had a family. But the others, of course, had families. They just didn't tell us about it. But Khrushchev introduced his family to the world, which was real innovation for the Soviet Union. And his first step in introducing his family on the world stage was to introduce his family to my grandmother. They were invited to Khrushchev's dacha on the Black Sea. Mrs. Khrushchev served them dinner. The whole family was there. And it was my grandmother who really invited Khrushchev to come. Roswell didn't have the manners to do that, but Grandma said, "It's been so nice to meet you and your family, and we've loved meeting your family and being entertained in your home. Please won't you come visit us? We'd love to have you meet our family." My grandma was an autopilot. She didn't really think that the head of the Soviet Union would show up in Coon Rapids, Iowa in the middle of the Cold War, but she was a lady. Of course she invited them. She and Mrs. Khrushchev got along great. They were very much alike. They were both devoted to their families, but the kind of ladies who read the paper every day and knew what was going on in the world. They both were very well educated, much better educated than their husbands were. My grandmother was a school teacher. Mrs. Khrushchev, first degree was in propaganda. She had a bachelor's degree in propaganda, which we would call marketing. And she also had another degree in English as a second language. She knew a little English. She was an English teacher. She and my grandma got along great. They were so alike. They were real ladies, very gracious, polite. My grandma was known to be polite to everyone from the garbage man to the president under any circumstance in the universe. She was a real lady. And both these ladies shared the fact that they were really quite embarrassed by how crude their husbands were. Both of them spent a lifetime trying to polish up their husbands a little bit, not very well.
How old would they have been at that time?
In 59 or
Yeah,
50?
or when they two ladies were together.
Nina would have been probably 5 years older than my grandma, I'm guessing, 10,
Okay.
something like that, and they were both right around 60 probably, something like that. We should have a few pictures, that'll help answer your question. Take it away, this is Khrushchev, upon the occasion of his visit. This is my grandfather. We can only wish that is mud on his shoes. That is not mud on his shoes. And this would be very typical of Roswell, right there. Okay, next one. In the classic pose of the time. Next one. The two ladies.
Oh my gosh.
They really liked each other. Exchanged Christmas cards until Nina died. They liked each other. Next one. We'll get to this picture in a little bit. Roswell went, in 56, by the way, Roswell was in Hungary, in Budapest, at Khrushchev's request, when Khrushchev sent tanks in to take over Hungary. The Hungarian Revolution was there when he was there. He had to escape down the Rhine in the middle of the night with my grandma. It was a pretty bad scene. Roswell was completely frosted at Khrushchev, furious at Khrushchev about this, and sort of canceled the relationship for about 6 months until he decided this is too important to just go back to World War III, and sort of decided to take up the relationship again. And at some point, I think there's a modern analog to that. At some point, we're going to have to figure out how to get along together. I don't know when that has to be, but sometime we're going to have to not have World War III. We have to figure out how we'll get along at some point. Khrushchev invited him back in 58. And by this time, Roswell has sold him seeds, seed technology, fertilizer technology, machinery technology. He was exporting all of this stuff. Went back in 58. In 59, Khrushchev contacted the U.S. State Department and said he wanted to visit the U.S. And he was trying, the U.S. was real reluctant. A lot of debate in this country whether we wanted to get out of World War III with these people. Sort of one of the interesting sidebars on the day was John F. Kennedy showed up the summer before Khrushchev in 1959, running for president, made a speech at Carroll Kemper High School Auditorium, and the theme of his speech is, "We do not want to let Khrushchev into this country." That's what he talked about when he was in Carroll, just a few months before Khrushchev actually came. It was very controversial whether we wanted to let him in. We finally decided we did want to let him in. He wanted to meet the president, a little summit. Pretty reluctant about it, though. The whole family came over. Khrushchev brought his whole family on this visit when we finally allowed him to come. Khrushchev said he had 3 main goals. He wanted to visit Disneyland, the Roswell Garst farm, and the president. And the State Department's real iffy about this, but they say, okay. So the family comes over, they fly to California to see Disneyland, and it was a pretty bad scene. They got him off the airplane and gave him the mayor of Los Angeles and the governor of California, between them, about an hour-and-a-half lecture on the subject of "we hate your guts, you dirty commies." And Khrushchev was so offended he threatened to go home right then. A very nasty beginning for this important visit. But fortunately, Frank Sinatra and Shirley MacLaine took over and made a real bad scene into a pretty good scene. The politician approach of, we hate you communists, just wasn't going to work. So Frank Sinatra takes him over, shows him Hollywood, wines and dines them, is nice to them, gets some pleasant photographs in the paper, and almost overnight, Khrushchev, in our eyes, starts getting to be a little bit cute. I mean, he's kind of funny, roly-poly guy. He wasn't the devil with horns, which a lot of Americans thought. And our views started transforming within a day or two of his arrival in this country of, well, he's not so bad. I mean, he can talk to Frank Sinatra, so he must be all right. They didn't let him visit Disneyland, which was their stated intention well before they came. Security reasons, they said. You can't visit Disneyland because it's not safe. And that might have been true, but it would have been polite to mention it before they showed up. They were just slamming him around. The next leg of his visit was Coon Rapids. He spent 2 days in Iowa. On September 22nd, 1959, he visited John Deere Works in Ankeny, Bookie Packing Plant in Des Moines, and there was a big fancy steak dinner at the Hotel Fort Des Moines. They spent the night in the Hotel Fort Des Moines. We had a hotel in Coon Rapids, but let me assure you, you would not even want to put your worst relative in that hotel. It was a bad local house of prostitution and whiskey. So he stayed in Des Moines and came out on September 23rd, 1959, spent all day, ag tours all morning, lunch in a circus tent in the backyard, more ag tours in the afternoon. In the late afternoon, they left and went to Iowa State University home ec department, and then got on a plane and flew to Pittsburgh, the next stop of their trip across the United States. The motives of the two guys. Khrushchev liked Roswell. We think he liked him a lot. And by the way, we're friends with Khrushchev's son, Sergei Khrushchev, who's this guy, who was a young man on the visit. Sergei, a little bit later, when Khrushchev is getting deposed, helped sneak all his dad's papers out of the Soviet Union. And in exchange for that, he could never go back to the Soviet Union. He was banned once he had let all the secrets escape, because Khrushchev's memoirs, there are about 4 versions of Khrushchev remembers his memoirs, but they're scathing about the leadership of the Soviet Union. So Sergei helped him out and became a U.S. citizen. He's a professor at Brown University, and we see him in Coon Rapids for various occasions. I think he's probably been to Coon Rapids 4 or 5 times in his life. His video camera, by the way, just recently came out. There's a documentary that's now like 2 years old on Iowa on public TV about Khrushchev's visit in America, and they got footage from that camera for that documentary, which I think is pretty cool. So in the memoirs that Sergei is currently working on, we've seen various drafts of that. He makes very clear that Khrushchev really liked Roswell. Kind of mystified why a capitalist would be nice, but liked him. But the real reason we think he came was much bigger than he liked Roswell. He had a huge problem. He knew as soon as he came to power, we had the technology he needed. He needed our technology. He was so far behind. So all during the last half of the 50s, he was sending delegations to our farm and other ag institutions all over the Midwest, trying to get his people to pick up our technology, but they weren't. The real problem he had was all his people thought that any idea coming from a running dog capitalist was not only evil, it was stupid. Just like we knew that about every one of their ideas. And not all their ideas were stupid. To this day, they're ahead of us in eye technology, eye surgery stuff. They're way ahead of us in that. But they were communists, so that was worse and bad and dumb and evil and stupid. That's how they thought about us. That we were dumb and evil and stupid, and any idea we had was, because that's what they learned. Furthermore, a good communist would be politically terrified to be seen talking to a known capitalist. It could ruin your career over there if you were seen talking to a capitalist, just like it was the kiss of death in this country to be seen talking to a known communist. Khrushchev was a really good communist. He believed in it, and he was powerful enough to get away with it. He came to our farm to lead by example. He had the visit to our farm made into books, magazines, movies, was taught in school textbooks for 20 years after the visit. He was trying to get across the message, it's okay for good communists to look to the West for ag technology. That's why he really came, we think. Roswell's motives were he was trying to make money. And he was very clear, very proud of the profit motive. He was trying to sell them stuff and make a profit. And he was proud of that, no problem. Profit motive is something you can understand and therefore in some ways trust, as opposed to altruism, which is where did that come from and is that genuine? Roswell was a real capitalist. He really was. He got a lot of grief about this relationship, but he was such a capitalist that he would even sell to communists. That's how he thought of it. And people wanted him to denounce the communists, and he would say, you know, it's really stupid to call your customers stupid. I'm not going to do that. I want to sell them stuff. I'm not going to call them stupid. But he really did think they were stupid, and their economic system was stupid. And he did think that. He was not a communist. But he didn't dwell on how stupid they are. He was trying to sell them product.
Was there a problem getting cash, you know, getting money converted to U.S. dollars?
Yes. Yes. They did come up with some hard currency, but it was an ongoing problem. Like Wallace, a lot of people thought Roswell was a commie for doing this. He got called a commie by a lot of people. He wasn't a communist. We lost quite a bit of sales, cancellation of seed orders from U.S. farmers who didn't want to buy their seed from someone they thought was a commie sympathizer. It was really controversial. In the short run, his trade versus the cancellations, it was about a wash. In the long run, we're sure it really helped us commercially. It made our brand name famous. It really helped us long term, we're sure. But in the short run, it didn't work out so well, so it's good he had another motive, and the other motive was he was a progressive too. He really bought into the idea that we have to figure out how to get along with the Soviet Union. His particular explanation on this was the phrase, hungry people are dangerous people. People don't sit back and starve if they're hungry. They go secure food supplies in Eastern Europe, and given their lousy technology, Eastern Europe wasn't enough food supply. They were hungry, and they were going to be restless and dangerous in the world till we had full belly diplomacy. So that was his other motive. Two other sidebars are on the day. Let's see a few pictures here. So this is let's back up, sorry. This is the cast of characters here. On the right is his son, Sergei. The next one is my father, Stephen. This is Khrushchev, my grandma in the flower print dress, Nina Khrushchev in the black suit, Radia Khrushchev, one of the daughters of Khrushchev, a couple of my aunts, my Uncle David, and another daughter, Khrushchev daughter is not in the picture. I don't know where she went. And in the front row, the most important people in this whole event, me, my brother Ed, and my cousin Sam. Now I'll tell you a little more about my memories in a minute. Next. So ag tours. Go ahead. Cattle feeding tours. Very thrilling to me. This is the horse pasture right outside the grandma's house, and it was the first time I ever saw a helicopter. Woo! And you can see the buses coming in and all that. So back up. We'll stop here. Couple sidebars on the day. The first was security. There was one of the reasons the State Department had been reluctant. What if there was an assassination? It would start World War III. All the nuclear bombs were built, just a matter of pressing the button. There was a real worry if someone assassinated Khrushchev on this visit that it would start World War III right then. That was one of the worries. So there was a lot of security involved in his visit in the United States because we had really almost extreme anti-communism going on. There were some really strong views about this in this country. So in Iowa, we imported National Guardsmen from all the surrounding states to help out. Guardsmen lined the road to Des Moines and every box culvert for 30 miles with machine guns on all the rooftops. I remember going to the farm that day with my dad and going through intersection after intersection checkpoints with guardsmen. To give you a flavor, at the last second, They didn't issue any bullets to the National Guardsmen. It was that bad. Security is a complete joke. This guy in the white polo shirt was a career criminal with a very long arrest record. Fortunately, he was not an assassin. He was just a petty crook. He'd been arrested for stealing gas and rewiring phone service to get it for free. But he was also kind of a jokester guy. He'd stolen a college football uniform a couple weeks before the Khrushchev visit and just appeared on the field during the game. 12th man on the team, just to spread a little chaos about. He was from Mason City. They hated him up there. This is a guy who would crash not only weddings to get free food. This is a guy who would crash funerals to get free food. He was that kind of guy. He just thought he'd come down and meet Khrushchev. The security people thought he was my dad or the hired hand. He peeled off when Khrushchev came into the house, but he was always there in a crowd. Khrushchev got very chummy with him, patted his belly, and joked about well-fed Americans. That would be Khrushchev. And it wasn't till the late afternoon that my granddad, in his usual and refined way, said, "Who in the hell are you anyway?" Whereupon it was discovered he was nobody. So much for security. The other big sidebar on the day was the press. And the next one. We had no idea how big a deal this was going to be. We'd had a lot of delegations on the farm, 55 through 59, and no one had ever paid any attention. And suddenly, we set up a press parking lot for 300 cars. Nobody knows how many reporters showed up, but maybe way more than 1,000. They crushed in the roof of our silo, terrified our cattle, kept breaking and entering into the house to get to the only telephone on the farm. My grandma said it best. She said, "Really, these reporters are worse than flies." Like a fly, they stay away longer than these people do. James Reston, a famous journalist of the New York Times who was here that day, wrote the next day in the New York Times that the press was awful. He was one of them. They were awful. He wrote they changed every aspect of Khrushchev's visit to the Iowa farm except one thing. The press did not change the smell of our farm, but other ones changed everything. And the most famous incident of the whole day, my grandfather was showing Khrushchev corn silage. And if you're not from a farm, corn silage is pickled, anaerobic sauerkraut corn. It stinks worse than sauerkraut. It's very odoriferous. He's showing Khrushchev corn silage, and the reporters are crowding him too close yet again, and in a fit of temper, he picked up big wads of corn silage and just let him have it. You can see that Khrushchev thinks this is really funny. The reporters thought it was pretty funny that Roswell's pelting reporters with corn silage. Everybody thought it was, some of you laughed. Everybody thought it was funny except one person. My grandmother waited till the guests left. She wouldn't have a scene in front of guests, but the second the guests left, she had my brother, cousin, and I on her piano bench, and she was in our face. Your grandfather threw corn silage at reporters, and people are laughing and think that's funny, and let me tell you, that is not funny. Don't you ever throw corn silage at reporters. Granddad did it, we didn't, Grandma. She was mortified till the day she died that her husband had been in Life magazine throwing corn silage at reporters. If you go see the beautiful exhibit at the home farm, this is the one picture that is not there. I have many important and profound memories about the whole day. The most important aspect of this visit, of Khrushchev's visit in America, was that I got out of school for the whole day. And my younger sisters were judged too young to come. I only had to put up with my brother. I liked my brother. But the day was pretty rocky at the start. I was a tomboy. Big fight about how I would be dressed. And you can see she won. The horrible white anklet socks, the scratchiest of petticoats, the laciest, heavy hair ribbons. It was just a rout. My brother also had a big fight with my mother, and you can conclude only that he should have kept fighting. The day got better. My mom had had a cesarean section a few weeks before the visit, had been in the hospital, lots of health problems with this pregnancy and birth. She checked out of the hospital to come to the Khrushchev visit, and that was a bad idea. She ended up spending all day upstairs resting. My Aunt Jo was always a lousy supervisor, which meant the three of us had the best day. I think it was the best day of my entire life. We had such a great day. The three of us spent most of the day innocently strolling back and forth in front of all the cameras. This was our chance to be movie stars. We didn't know the difference between TV cameras and movie cameras. We were going to be movie stars out of this. Drove the cameramen nuts. We already knew about Russians because we'd had a lot on the farm. And even today, if you run into a former Soviet person, their souvenir they hand out is medals. Medals on their chest. And we knew that, so separately to maximize our yield, we hit up every Russian on the place for their medals. And the nice ones we hit up several times. Let's take the next picture. I very much remember this. Mrs. Khrushchev had been scheduled to tour the school in Main Street that day, but she'd been on the road for several days, wanted out of all touring, just wanted to hang out with her friend, my grandma, and the house and yard, and that's where I spent all day. So I got to know her pretty well, and I remember feeling so comfortable. She spoke pretty good English. She didn't hold me too tight. She smelled really good. I really liked her then. A little bit later, I was scuffling with one of the Thomas kids outside under the apple tree. Mrs. Khrushchev strolled by, caught us fighting, separated us, got her fingers right in our face and said, "The little brothers and sisters mustn't fight here." Which we thought was pretty funny because we weren't a brother and sister. The highlight of the day, I sang Adelaide Stevenson, his campaign song. Adelaide Stevenson was another great progressive of the era who was there that day. But my most vivid memory is as one of the security procedures, they had one Soviet and one American taste each dish an hour before lunch to make sure it wasn't poison. And we were informed this was what was going on. And the three of us, we trailed those two food tasters, choking ourselves, demonstrating what it would be like when they died of food poisoning, dropping on the ground behind them, praying they would die of food poisoning. They didn't, but how exciting. Just how exciting to even think that was possible.
Oh my God.
That's me.
Wow.
Next. He was sort of loud and a little bit scary. The Soviet Union, Roswell kept going back there, traveling Eastern Europe. As his health failed, my Uncle John Crystal started going in his place. We think John went a total of 60 times in his life. Mostly the progressive idea, occasionally the commercial idea, but we kept the relationship going and going and going. It fell apart at various points after Khrushchev disappeared. We were out of favor over there, and it stopped. Then it got going again. My Uncle John hated Yeltsin, so it stopped because my Uncle John hated him. And it's up, but it's kept going even to this day. John and Roswell, and especially John, worked on several big problems. First of all, using corn wisely. But the next big thing they worked on was soybeans. We grow soybeans in this country for protein and animal rations. We were pitching, you got to get some protein in your animal rations. And they really resisted soybeans for a long time, probably as a counter-reaction to Khrushchev so badly overdoing the corn in the first place. But they got going on that. By far their biggest problem has been distribution, getting it from the farm field into the dinner plate. My dad is old, but 15 years ago, 60% of their perishables were being lost between the farm field and the dinner plate. About 30% of their grains. To get food from the farm field to the dinner plate, good roads, good storage, good processing, and good packaging. The roads is public investment, and the other three is a real thing that capitalism does very well. Price. Price tells us that we should freeze the green beans or can the green beans or sell them fresh, and we should have them in New York or Ohio or San Francisco. Price tells us how to handle all our food products, what they need to work. And without price signals, a top-down command system, their distribution system was simply appalling for a really long time. They are doing better now. They're doing a lot better now, but they are not as good as we are. And the main reason they're not doing as well as we are is because they're not as lucky as we are. We are lucky. We have beautiful soils and a climate to grow grain on those beautiful soils. In the Soviet Union, where they have good soils, that's Ukraine and points north. The Ukraine's like the middle of Minnesota. It's way north and it's way dry where they have good soils. Where they have good climate, which would be like Georgia, they have only red clay and nothing else. So they just don't have that intersection of soil and climate that makes us such a powerhouse. And their management is as good as ours, but they've come a long way since this story started. The end.
Mm-hmm.